back in the 1950s, President Eisenhower was concerned about what he called the campaign of hatred against us in the Arab world, not among the governments, who are more or less okay, but among the people. This is a secret then, it's been declassified since. The National Security Council, major planning agency, issued a memorandum on this issue. It stated that there's a perception in the Arab world that the United States supports harsh and brutal dictatorships, and that the U.S. blocks democracy and development, and we do it because we want to control their resources. And it went on to say that the perception is more or less accurate, and furthermore, that's what we ought to be doing. And as long as the population's quiet, it doesn't matter. The dictators support us, so everything's fine. That's 1958. 2001, Defense Science Board essentially came up with the same conclusion. The same conclusion holds this today. It was strikingly illustrated in the WikiLeaks revelations. One of the ones that got the most publicity, big headlines, euphoric commentary, were the revelations in cables that the Arabs support U.S. policy towards Iran. That's really important. One slight flaw in those reports: they were referring to the Arab dictators. They allegedly support our policies towards Iran. What about the Arab population? Well, we know their feelings. There are major polls taken by the U.S., the leading U.S. polling agencies, released by prestigious institutions, booking institutions, not reported in the United States, incidentally. As far as I know, one report in England, Jonathan Steele had an article in The Guardian about it. I think that's the only one. They're interesting. They say that there are indeed Arabs who support U.S. policies on Iran. About 10% think that Iran is a threat. Overwhelmingly, they regard the United States and Israel as the major threats. Egypt, 90% regard the United States as the major threat. In fact, opposition to U.S. policies is so strong that a majority favor, say the region would be better off if Iran had nuclear weapons. Almost 80% in Egypt, high percentage in the rest of the region. Well, that won't do, again, for the usual reasons. So therefore, this is almost totally suppressed, as far as I know. Steele is the only report in the English-speaking world outside of critical. I write about it. Other people in the margins write about it. But what the reactions reveal once again the simply extreme contempt for democracy. As long as the dictators back us, it really doesn't matter what the population thinks. If there's a campaign of hatred against us among the population and the dictators are in control, everything's fine. Euphoric headlines. That was 1958, 2001, today. It's standard. In the case of Britain, it goes back much earlier. It goes back a century and a half, 2 centuries. The U.S., it's standard since the U.S. replaced Britain as global hegemon. And France is the same, if not worse. In fact, every great power acts pretty much the same way. Well, these are things in the background of terrorism. You have to pay attention to them. We also know pretty well how to deal with terrorism. In fact, Britain led the way in this case. In Northern Ireland, terrorism was pretty serious. The IRA terror. British terror was even worse, of course, but that's the usual balance of forces. But IRA terror was not a joke. As long as Britain reacted to it with greater terror, the cycle of terrorism increased. And finally, in the 90s, Britain finally responded with U.S. pressure in this case in a sensible way. They tried to pay attention to the grievances that lay behind the terror. There were grievances, real ones. As Britain started to pay attention to the grievances, terror reduced, people who'd been involved, IRA hitmen were brought into negotiations. Some of them now ended up in the government. It's not utopia, but it's a big difference from what it was before. I was actually in Belfast in 1993, and it was like a war zone. I was back last year, and it's peaceful. There's tensions, but the kind of tensions that exist in every city. I mean, I couldn't see them, but people told me, this is a Protestant neighborhood. If you're Catholic, you don't go into it, and that sort of thing. But it certainly wasn't what it was in 1993. Okay, that's the way to deal with terror. Take a look at its causes and its sources, if you want to reduce it. But states do not consider terror a major problem. That's true of Britain and the United States, for example. This came out in the Chilcot hearings clearly. The head of British intelligence testified that when the U.S. and Britain invaded Iraq, they both anticipated that it would increase terror. Actually, it did a lot more than anyone expected. Increased it by about a factor of 7. But they both anticipated it was going to increase terror, but there are other purposes. There are higher priorities than protecting the domestic populations. So they went to war. And that's not unusual. If there were time, go over many more examples. Anyhow, I think these are some of the things that should be kept in mind in thinking about the return to barbarism in our time, the plague of terrorism in our age, and so on.